Thanks again for the invitation to participate in the conference. It's been a great day and a half discussing many interesting papers. And I'm very happy to have been assigned the paper by Larry Ball, which I really enjoyed. So before the usual caveat that the opinion here are mine and not reflective of the opinion of the bank or other members. So I'll give a brief summary of the paper which Larry presented very clearly. So they advocate in favor of the use of median inflation, weighted cross-sectional median, as a measure of core. And the idea being that it automatically filters out large relative price shocks. So it does so better than core excluding food and energy, which sort of ex ante takes out only these two sectors. And the argument is that, these relative price shocks happen elsewhere in the economy across industries. And so the median sort of, or maybe the trim mean as well, they sort of do that automatically exposed instead of just doing that on average ex ante by excluding the more volatile sectors. So in the paper, they do three types of analysis, some descriptive statistics and univariate analysis of the various series, case studies of inflation developments in 2017 and 2018, which Larry just covered, and then analysis of a simple Phillips curve focusing on goodness of fit and stability. So just to recap the main results, here are the charts that Larry covered for PCE. So the left chart is for core PCE, excluding food and energy, and the right one is for median PCE. And you can clearly see the better fit of the Phillips curve on the right panel, and more so when you look at the more recent period since the great financial crisis, where the Phillips curve pretty much disappears with core X food and energy, and it's still there with median. So I have only a few comments on the paper, which I really liked. I think it's great. It's policy relevant. It's very simple, and it's pretty convincing. There's one thing that I missed in the paper, which is a discussion of sort of normative issues, discussion on welfare. So I think I'm kind of convinced that median inflation is sort of easier to make sense of. Perhaps it's easier to forecast as well, but just because it's easier, it sort of works better in a Phillips curve doesn't mean that that's the right measure to focus on. So, is there a case for stabilizing that measure, or is it just a useful auxiliary variable to sort of do your job and focus on headline inflation a few quarters or years out? So I missed some discussion of that. Perhaps one way to do it would be to relate to lessons from sticky price models, where there's some theory of what is the role of these relative prices and so forth. So for example, one rationalization of core excluding food and energy, which I think is not the reason why that emerged, but it's sort of consistent with the theory, is that it should focus on stabilizing inflation in the relatively stickier sectors, and food and energy are quite volatile, and when you look at the underlying microdata, prices are quite flexible. They change pretty much all the time. So maybe it's a coincidence, but that measure of core sort of can be rationalized also through a welfare perspective. And there's some literature on generalizing that idea. So there's a nice paper, Bart is one of the co-authors here. It's called CONDI, Cost of Nominal Distortions Index, if I remember correctly. It's an AJ Macro paper, which sort of constructs the theoretical measure of inflation that's justified on the basis of these differences of stickiness across sectors. So that's the only thing that I think was really missing in the paper from my perspective. So what I'll do next is show you some Brazilian data, pretty much redoing what Larry and Sandeep did with US data, and that helped me get convinced that this sort of really works and it's useful. So here is some scatter plots of normalized values, so z-scores of these variables just for simplicity. The left panel is headline CPI for Brazil. The sample is from 2003 until just now. The middle one is core excluding food and energy, which we don't use in Brazil, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And the last one is median inflation, constructed by weighting the cross-section at the sub-item level. So we use 380-something sub-items and construct the weighted median from that level of disaggregation. If you run sort of the same or similar type of Phillips curves that Larry and Sandeep did, this is with monthly data. That's one difference. But we didn't even bother to try to adjust the specification. So the gap measure, it's a 4-period moving average of an unemployment gap, akin to what they do in the paper, but they use quarterly, we use monthly. We didn't even bother to fine-tune the lag, just to see whether like a first pass would work, and it does. So one way to see that is to focus on the fit. So X food and energy, fit is 0, R square is 0. There's no Phillips curve. We could see that eyeballing the first figure. It turns out that in Brazil, this specification for headline is reasonable, surprisingly so. But for median, you get a bit better fit. And also, as in the paper, when you run the specification with median, the constants that we allow for in the econometric specification and according to the specification of the Phillips curve should be 0, turns out to be 0 in the data as well, whereas it's positive for these other two measures. So in Brazil, we look at a range of core measures. So we did that as well for some other measures. So the first 4 are measures by exclusion, but they are not excluding food and energy. So they exclude regulated prices and volatile food prices. They're sort of judgmental exclusions that are different across these 4 core measures. This one here is a double-weighted core where you downplay the weight of the more volatile indices, items, but without excluding them. This MA here stands for the trimmed mean. That hasn't been translated, but that's like exactly the trimmed mean. And this is a smooth version of the trimmed mean, which I can talk about over a coffee break if someone is interested. It turns out that there are some judgmental cores which sort of do as well as the median in terms of fit, are squares of around 0.15, 0.16. That's roughly a correlation of 0.4. And then we did another thing which turned out to produce an interesting result, I thought, which was to look at percentiles. So the paper focused on median, but you could do the same exercise looking at different cross-sectional percentiles. And here there's an interesting result which I think could be further explored, and I'm encouraging my team to try to do so, which is that the bottom part of the cross-sectional distribution yields a better fit with this simple measure of the gap. So in particular, just in terms of point numbers, the lower decile actually has the highest R square, so it provides you sort of the tightest fit in terms of those scatter plots. But it's sort of relatively consistent that in the bottom part of the cross-sectional distribution, you have a better fit for these simple Phillips curves relative to the top of the distribution. In particular, when you go to the upper deciles or percentiles, you get nothing. So it seems that there's some more information in the lower levels of inflation across the cross-sectional distribution. They seem to be more informative of slack, at least according to the simplification. And this resonates something that somebody alluded to yesterday. I don't remember exactly who it was, but talking about some possible asymmetries that you pick up the Phillips curve in some side of the cycle, but not the other side. Here, it seems that maybe the lower percentiles are more informative. We did the same for the sort of post-crisis sample. Oh no, sorry. These are just the scatter plots for showing that the Phillips curve sort of fades as you move to the higher percentiles. We did the same looking at this post-crisis sample, and here it also echoes a result that Fernanda talked about yesterday, which is for Brazil, which is a non-crisis hit economy, the Phillips curve actually fits better. It shows up more clearly after the crisis than if you look at the whole sample, which includes the period before. Here we go to R-squares as high as 0.4 for median. Headline inflation is pretty reasonable as well. And again, ex-food and energy doesn't work in Brazil. We do the same for the percentiles. The pattern, these are the other measures of core. And here I'll talk briefly about the last one, which wasn't on the first part of the slides, which is this CFC core, which stands for a common factor core. And the reason is that because we only constructed these measures since 2007, and this is like a filtered version in a state space model, with kind of various measures of inflation, akin to measures that many people have constructed, Mark and Jim in various papers. Is similar also to the underlying inflation gauge from the New York Fed. And that's kind of another way that you can use to filter out these various idiosyncratic shocks and try to pick up a common component of various inflation measures. And you can see that measure also has a pretty high R-squared, comparable to the cores that do best along that metric in terms of judgmental exclusion of some of the components. These are the percentiles for the post-crisis period, and again the pattern is roughly there. So the fit worsens as you move to higher and higher percentiles or the size of the distribution, and it's better in the lower sort of percentile. Finally, just to eyeball the difference between this common factor core and median inflation, they have sort of reasonable fluctuations, so reasonable, comparable or similar patterns over the business cycle. And so maybe one way to think about it, and that's I think how the paper is pitched, is that this might be a first pass, like an easy way to get at one of these common component measures without having to estimate like a more complex state space model. And it's very easy to do, and it works reasonably well. In Brazil, you can see that median inflation lies on average a bit below this common factor core. That's a feature that you see. Inflation is, when you look at the cross-section, is rightly skewed, so the percentile that sort of nails the right average is around the 55th percentile, a bit above the median for the Brazilian data. But again, like I mentioned for the median inflation measure, all these other cores, common factor or other percentiles or other measure by exclusion, I think they're all subject to the same point, that why should we focus on those measures? So it could be because they are useful for forecasting, or maybe because they have some normative basis for doing so, but I think that's the part that we're missing. And I'll stop here. Thank you.